Really lovely to see some familiar names and faces on this call, and I am going to be covering some of the same issues that Nikki's been talking about, but from a slightly more legal angle. Alana, the next slide shows an overview of what I'll be covering, and it will be a real whistle-stop tour. And I probably, since it's the legal piece, have to give a bit of a legal disclaimer, as Nikki's alluded to. This is really an increasingly nuanced and textured and complicated area, and often these decisions are really fact and context specific. So this is kind of a broad brush overview, but if you need legal advice, please talk to a lawyer, and happy to follow up if anyone has questions about how this might affect your business. So on the next slide, where Nikki was going to use headlines, I've got a graph, and this is slightly misleading. This is the trend in climate litigation worldwide up to May last year. But I think it tells a relevant story, because a portion of these cases are what this London School of Economics report from which the graph is taken calls climate washing cases, which are obviously a subset of greenwashing cases, but they're on the rise exponentially. And it's not just litigation, which is represented in this graph, but it's action by regulators increasingly, as Nikki's talked about. And I'll talk a little bit about where those claims are coming from in a minute. I guess my key message, and Nikki's touched on this a little bit, is it's not just advertising. I was talking to somebody the other day and talking about how many greenwashing issues have come across my desk in the short time I've been at Chapman Tripp, which I started in December last year. And they said, oh, I thought greenwashing was an advertising issue. And my message would be, actually, it's not anymore. Any public-facing statements you're making will be subject to scrutiny if they're making claims about your green, climate, or sustainability credentials. Megan talked about green hushing as well, which is a new trend, which is, as Megan said, companies being more reticent to make claims because they're worried about the risk. And a new one, green wishing, which is where you have emissions reduction targets, for example, or claims which are simply unsubstantiated, and that's an increasing risk area we're seeing as well. So the next slide talks a little bit about the types of claims that we're seeing. I've bucketed them up into 4 broad categories. So we're seeing a lot of claims around misused terminology or labelling. Nikki touched on some of this around, organic or biodegradable. And another way of talking about this is a truth to label. So does it do what it says on the tin, basically? We're also seeing challenges to emissions reduction targets for being, not being fully thought through, being unrealistic, or as the third category indicates, not being well substantiated. And here your reporting, as Nikki also mentioned, is a really useful tool to provide that substantiation and show that you're walking the talk, even if you don't have all the answers, which I'll come back to in a minute. And then the final category I'd mention is increasingly we're seeing allegations that a company has overstated its progress towards or its role in the low carbon transition, and that can really be easily done. You want to create a nice snappy headline, as HSBC did for these advertisements in the bus stop in the UK, and then it got wrapped over the knuckles by the Advertising Standards Authority in the UK because these ads didn't sufficiently disclose that. In addition to doing some good stuff on climate change, HSBC is continuing to lend significant amounts of money to the fossil fuel industry. So I think that there's a lot going on, and it can be difficult to navigate. So I think that if we go to the next slide, Alana, I'll do, this is kind of the boring legal bit, take you through where the legal liability comes from in New Zealand and who we're seeing taking these kinds of claims or doing these kinds of investigations. So in New Zealand, principally, we talk about the Fair Trading Act and the Financial Markets Conduct Act, if you're talking about your financial reporting, which will include climate-related disclosures, importantly, which essentially prevents you from any kind of misleading or deceptive claims. And that can include misleading by omission, importantly. So what you don't say is just as important as what you do say. You'll see regulatory enforcement increasingly coming from the regulators. So in Australia, we've seen a huge growth in investigations by the Australian Securities and Investment Commission. I think they filed something like they issued 9 infringement notices in the 6 months since October last year, and Nikki mentioned they've just taken their first legal case to court against Mercer Superannuation Fund. And we haven't seen so much activity like that in New Zealand, but we're expecting that to change. So last year there was a claim by the Lawyers for Climate Action initiative against Z Energy for their Moving with the Times campaign, which the Commerce Commission declined to progress, but we know that they do have it as a strategic focus. And we also know that the Financial Markets Authority have been looking at the green claims of some funds, and they also have this as a strategic focus, so we can expect activity in this space to pick up. Talked about advertising standards claims. Often they're brought by NGOs or competitors, and in New Zealand that would be through the Advertising Standards Authority. We're seeing a lot of shareholder activism and private litigation against companies for misleading or unsubstantiated statements. I've got client as symbol there because they're sort of doing both. They're a climate activist NGO, but they've also, as everyone will have seen in the headlines, got some shares in Shell, and they're now suing the directors personally for not playing a sufficient role in the transition or not turning Shell's strategy around sufficiently. And I just at the bottom note there that you have liability for the company as a whole and its officers, but also for the directors personally as well, as indicated by the Shell claim, and the same or similar laws apply in New Zealand. So yes, lots of potential sources of liability, lots of potential sort of avenues for that action. So what do you do about it? The important bit, right? And this echoes, I think, some of the things that Nikki was saying as well. So when you're thinking about managing your greenwashing risk, I suppose before I get into these bullets, do make sure that you're working across the organisation. I mean, part of my role, the reason for it coming into being, is because these issues for our clients are not sitting neatly in any one bucket or any one discipline. You know, they're legal, they're sustainability, increasingly they're communications issues. So work as a team and make sure that you're approaching this in a pan-organisational way. So when it comes to your emissions targets, your transition plans and your reporting, walk the talk and talk about it. So make sure that you're doing what you're saying or intimating that you're doing, but also make sure that you've got the disclosures there to back it up. And Nikki mentioned this. So yeah, like I say, your reporting can be a really helpful avenue. And really critically, give the full picture. So if you don't have all the answers to how you're going to get to your net zero goal, that's okay, but make sure that that's disclosed. If you've got technological assumptions, or you're reliant on particular developments in government policy, just talk about that, because we're seeing some of the legal cases in Australia having that omission being the grounds for claim. And in advertising, just review your sustainability claims before they're published. Like Nikki says, whether it's your comms professionals or your legal team, just have some key risk words and make sure that they're vetted against those. Keep the evidence, so make sure that you've got in your back pocket all of the stuff that backs up what you're saying, so that you can bring that out if you are challenged in future. And something that we're seeing more and more of is a bit of a greenwashing risk assessment. So what have you got out there on green claims and sustainability, and what are your risk points? You know, are they all kosher, and should any of them be moderated slightly to reduce risk?